Don't think about what's in it for you, but think about what's in it for the practice. How is the legacy ultimately going to survive? Am I going to be able to retain the key staff that allowed me to get to where I got to today?
Welcome to That's Derm Good. I'm Janelle Ball, and I'm excited to bring you thought-provoking conversations about biologics, specialty medications, treatments, and so much more. I'll be chatting with some amazing guests about access, affordability, and advocacy. You're really going to enjoy this show. And now a message from Sanofi and Regeneron. Learn more about Dupixent dupilumab at www.dupixenthcp.com. Welcome to That's Derm Good. Today, my guest is Michael Kroin. He is the CEO and managing partner of Physician Growth Partners. So welcome, Michael. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yes. So I'm excited to hear a little bit about PGP, Physician Growth Partners, how that started. You're managing partner. So, what is your background and how did you get started with this company, and what is the goal of your company?
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question. So I started my career off in healthcare investment banking, where I spent most of my time working with physician groups and representing them in transactions with private equity. And throughout my career, I saw an opportunity to start Physician Growth Partners to not only advocate for physicians on getting the best economic outcome for them, but ultimately helping them navigate through their decisions on really putting themselves in the best position to determine which groups would be ultimately the right cultural fit for them. When I was at my past shop, and most of the time was spent on focusing on the economics of the transaction rather than truly understanding if the group in front of them or the private equity partner in front of them was truly the right fit for their organization, whether it's from a control perspective to ensure that they can practice the same way they have historically, whether it's from a resource perspective and really understand, can these private equity groups come in and actually help the organization continue to grow, but at the same time be mindful to not impact the patient care profile, right? So from that lens, we started Physician Growth Partners really to advocate on not just the economic side of the deal, but also around the cultural side and ensuring that they're making a decision that's really right for their organization from a long-term perspective.
Yeah, that's important too, because, when you think about that culture and making sure patients are still being supported throughout that process.
Yeah, no, very much so. I think the biggest thing that I think about when, doctors are exploring a potential transaction is they really need to understand what changes are ultimately going to happen at the local level and what are they still going to be able to maintain in terms of control at the local level. And the goal in a transaction process is obviously you want to monetarily reward yourself for the business you've built, but at the same time, there's a reason why your organization has been so successful, right, to where it is today. And it's really crucial to find a partner that truly understands that, to ensure that they won't try to fix things that are not broken.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, it's so important to also, from a physician lens, to understand how much control can they actually retain at the local level to ensure that they can practice medicine the same way before a transaction as they can after the transaction.
Mm-hmm.
And even more so, they need to also think about it from a lens of not just their clinical practice, but also the day-to-day decision making, right? What input do they have? How much control do they have there? Because from that lens, I think that's where you hear some horror stories, but also you can hear some success stories is saying, hey, look, these private equity partners are coming in and they're really focusing on empowering us or supporting us versus coming in and telling a doctor what to do, which we all know you can't do, right?
Yeah. But it does happen. I think there's a lot of fear sometimes with staff thinking, oh, now what am I going to do? Because my doctor was so, close and supportive of whatever situation or just the hiring process, I guess. And they're afraid that they're going to lose some of that. How do you provide that, we call it like a white glove service and support to the offices to ensure that they don't feel like they're, if this happens, then I might lose my job or they're going to change
Right.
everything.
So look, I'll tell you right now, just like in any industry sector, et cetera, not all private equity groups are created equal,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's good doctors out there, there's bad doctors right there, right?
Yeah.
There's also doctors that may be criminals, right? At the same time, there's good private equity out there and bad private equity. And the private equity and the evolution of private equity, you really need to determine which groups through legal negotiations and business negotiations, economic negotiations, all through the negotiation process, which groups will respect and appreciate the opportunity for you to still make the day-to-day decisions around hiring, firing staff,
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, promoting folks to partnership, at the same time being able to choose some of your vendors that you have historically, understanding the vacation days, how many support staff you have per doctor, right? If you historically had 2 or 3 MAs, you continue to be able to maintain that. So there's so much more into this negotiation that we advocate for to allow and retain control at the local level. And it's not just on the thought of how they see patients, but it's also associated with the support that is surrounding them. And I think that's a big thing that folks need to think about when they're ultimately exploring this process is don't think about what's in it for you, but think about what's in it for the practice. How is the legacy ultimately going to survive? Am I going to be able to retain the key staff that allowed me to get to where I got to today? And I
Mm-hmm.
think from my lens, again, when we think about the good private equity groups out there, look, they need the good human capital. There's a reason why those individuals got to where they are today, and they've been in the organization for the last 15, 20, 25 years. So they need to trust the doctor to make those decisions even after the partnership, because the group that knows the practice the best is really the owners, right? They will continue to know the best. And look, in these deals, for the most part, the shareholders who ultimately realize this reward, they're actually not going anywhere after the deal. They are signing themselves up for basically the rest of their career associated with this type of partnership, at least for 5 years for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
So, from that perspective, I think the support staff really do need to understand, hey, ensuring support staff really needs to ensure to the ownership or the shareholders, hey, make sure you're thinking about the thought process of you still being able to make some of these decisions on a day-to-day basis, right? And I think that's what's so important. That's what's a lot of times overlooked in these transactions is not what's in it for the doctor and their ability to control their clinical practice, but also the folks that are surrounding them. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. So, what led you to focus on physicians and dermatology in particular?
So what led me to focus on physicians? So my whole family's in healthcare. So my mom's a doctor. Both my sisters are doctors. It's funny when I actually told my parents that I wasn't going to become a doctor, they thought I was a big failure in the family. Uh, so hopefully the next best thing I could do is kind of figure out how I can stay with, keep my toes wet in healthcare. And I found myself in the healthcare investment banking world. Um, throughout my career in the healthcare investment banking world, there was historically, and actually to be completely transparent, dermatology was one of the earlier sectors to start consolidating within the private equity community. And at the same time, it was one of the newer relationships where investors started coming into healthcare within the physician practice ecosystem. And from that lens, there was a lot of misunderstanding when private equity came into healthcare, into dermatology, around how can they actually work with doctors to help them.
Mm-hmm.
So through that lens, due to the fact that it was like more of an earlier mover, we saw an opportunity to say, hey, let's start advocating for these physicians. Let's start advocating for these dermatologists. A lot of them are thinking about private equity and thinking about exploring a sale. Let's jump in and kind of educate them to see if it makes sense for their practice.
Mm-hmm. So, would that be more of the doctors that are looking to retire in the next 5 years, or want to make sure that their practice is not just going to completely fall apart because reimbursements and stuff is just getting more and more expensive?
Right. So I think a couple things. I think at the end of the day, just at a higher level, before I touch on like what doctor ultimately fits the criteria of potentially exploring a private equity sale, I think you hit the nail on the head. At the highest level, practicing medicine today is a lot harder than it was yesterday. Practicing medicine tomorrow is going to be a lot harder than it is today.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, over the last 20 years, you see reimbursement rates either kind of decline or kind of be at steady state at best. But at the same time, you see what's going on with inflation. You see what's going on with costs going up on the vendor side, supply side, et cetera, rent continuing to increase, right? And what it does, it ultimately marginalizes or creates a, let's call it a profile where if the doctor or the physician group isn't continuing to grow, they're ultimately putting themselves at risk, right? Of continuing to survive or make the same amount that they made historically. At the same time, you also have hospitals and health systems that are continuing to consolidate, right? You also have payers that are multi-billion-dollar organizations that are continuing to come together. And what are they doing? They're continuing to put more pressure on the independent practice of medicine. So for doctors to be able to identify and find opportunities where they can get a backbone that can help support and be an advocate for them to build economies of scale, to then have some leverage over their suppliers or their vendors, have leverage over some of their benefit plans that they now can benefit from because they have a much larger pool of a population, right? At the same time, being able to hopefully eventually go back to the payers and say, hey, you historically continue to knock me down. Well, now we have we're controlling a patient population. Let's actually come to the table and let's find a reasonable way to solve for the issues that you ultimately continue to drive towards us. So I think this whole concept of private equity, if done right, and if focused on the right groups, I think it can be a very big advocate to allow the independent practice of medicine to continue to survive if it's done the right way, if it's negotiated the right way where the doctor continues to maintain their name on the door, if it's negotiated in a way that they continue to maintain their control of their practice from a clinical side and some of the day-to-day side, right? Because that's the entrepreneurial spirit that folks are continuing to look for. So if some of those boxes are checked when you're negotiating a private equity deal, and that private equity group does know what they're doing, right? They have a good track record. It ultimately puts you in a position to say, well, now I do have a larger body to help support and go up against what's coming in front of us, which is, again, payers, hospitals, et cetera, to be able to continue to combat and allow independent practice of medicine survive.
Yeah.
I think there's three ways that I would say 3 or 4 different reasons where a doctor kind of should be looking to private equity. I think the first is call it the necessity of additional capital or significant capital to continue to scale, where they're saying, hey, look, to continue to grow, I need to open up maybe 2 more offices. I need to hire 3, 4 new providers. It's going to cost me a couple $1,000,000. I'm at a point in my career where I don't want to have that risk appetite to continue double, triple down. I need someone to help provide that capital and help support me in the vision of continuing to build the organization. I think the second kind of view is where we see practices kind of built to a scale where perhaps they dominate their market. And now they're kind of saying, well, for me to continue to grow, I need additional resources, right? Perhaps I need folks that will solely focus on helping us negotiate with payers. I need folks that will solely focus on and have an HR department to deal with some of the issues that come along with benefits and benefits and administrative program, et cetera, right? I need folks that may help me with the legal side, right? I need folks that can help me with find other opportunities or practices to acquire and bring them under my umbrella. So that next wave, it's, hey, look, I've kind of got to an inflection point, but to continue to go, I need more resources, right? And I need help because I can't do this on my own because I founded this practice to continue practice medicine, but I find myself just spending majority of my time on the administrative side. So how do I alleviate that and ultimately focus in on what I do best, right? And then I think the last piece I would say that it's relevant is doctors that are potentially kind of have a 5 to 7 year or they're 5 to 7 years away from retirement, right? And from that lens, they should start looking at succession planning now, because any sort of transaction, if they want to benefit for the business that they built and reward themselves, whoever the partner is they're going to want them to stay on for at least 5 years because they're going to want to know the know-how. They're going to want them to continue to operate and slowly transition some of the administrative work that they've done, some of the clinical work that they've done, or some of the patients that they're seeing. They need to have that seamless transition, and they need to learn from that doctor so that they can potentially replicate his services, his or her services, when they go off into retirement.
Mm-hmm.
So those are kind of some of the areas where we see where groups start to focus in on. It's when they need more capital, they need additional resources, or they're kind of closer towards the end of their career looking for a succession plan. But I think
Right.
all those three buckets that I would just kind of close out with, it's a way to de-risk yourself, right? And also reward yourself for all the risks you took to get to where you are today. And again, if it's done right and you find the right partner, there's really nothing wrong with going down that route.
Yeah. So, what are some things that a physician should look for when they're interested and they don't know, where to go, or maybe they've heard negative things from other acquisitions that have happened, maybe with their colleagues and things like that. So, what should they be questioning?
I think the biggest thing that you need to think about, I would kind of look at it from, let's call it three, four check boxes. Number one, you ultimately need to understand from your perspective when you're kind of going through this journey is what type of control will ultimately be maintained at the local level, right? When you're kind of evaluating private equity. So the first order of business is understanding how much control can you retain, depending on who you're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
The second bucket is what type of resources can these groups provide to help me or to alleviate some of the burden that I have experienced or is the reason why I'm potentially experiencing this. Like, what can they provide, right? And I mentioned some of the examples, HR, helping with acquiring practice, opening up new locations, or you name it, right? But at the end of the day, the group that you're evaluating, do they have the appropriate resources to actually help you, right? The third piece that when you're kind of thinking about a private equity partner is what is their track record, right? Have they done this already successfully, whether it's in the dermatology or medical aesthetic specialty, or it is in another sector, right? And not just looking at their financials, but understanding how, what's their physician attrition, understanding how they continue to seek to align with, younger doctors that potentially were promised partnership, but now a doctor ended up going through this transaction, understand how they focus on treating those folks because those are the future, right? If
Mm-hmm.
I'm sitting here and saying I'm 5 to 7 years out, well, guess what? Who's the next generation that's going to come in and help operate and run the practice? So I think there's a lot of key questions to ask to understand the track record, not just from a financial front, but also understanding some of the dynamics and how they focus in more so on how to align with the physician group, whether they're partners or associates, to ensure that the alignment is sustainable from a long-term perspective. Because if you don't have the alignment sustainable from a long-term perspective between investors and physicians, it's not going to be successful,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I would say kind of when someone's evaluating a process, it's control, it's what type of resource, what's their track record, and then at the end of the day, look at it from an economic perspective, saying, hey, look, what they're valuing me, is it in a good place where I'm comfortable to move forward? But if one of those four boxes aren't checked, where you're not comfortable with economics, you're not comfortable with the control you can maintain, you're not comfortable that they have a good track record or they have the resources to actually help you, don't do the deal. Life's
Yeah.
too short, right? It's way too short. This is a decision you have to live for the rest of your career. So you really don't want to put yourself in a position that ultimately makes you kind of feel like you made the wrong decision because
Right.
it's really hard to unwind that.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, I mean, you could essentially, say there's a doctor and they've got one of their children has decided to become a doctor, and, you know, they want to hand that down, but they don't want them to go through, the financial burden and the issues and things that can come with running a practice. Maybe they may not be built for the management side of the financial side of running a business as well. So
Right.
they could essentially set them up for success by having a partnership with private equity.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a situation that we actually see. Not all of our clients, but several clients do have, some of their children that are going in the medicine field, right? Whether they end up becoming a dermatologist or X, Y, and Z, I think it's too early to tell. But I think for the most part, the focus really is to ensure that, hey, look, as part of the process, hey, look, I might have some kids that might be coming my way and that might be coming to become a dermatologist. Can we figure out maybe from an estate perspective or something like that, that they could benefit from some of the equity that I roll over, or some things that ultimately can drive them to kind of eventually take over if that is an opportunity. I think
Mhm.
that there are options like that to solve for certain situations like that.
Thank you to Sanofi and Regeneron, who invite you to learn more about Dupixent dupilumab at www.dupixenthcp.com. What does an acquisition look like? Is it completely sold to the private equity, or do they have shares? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, a private equity transaction will involve a purchase price, right, for the business. But that purchase price will be broken down by cash that you receive at close and equity into the organization. So you're
Mm-hmm.
ultimately going to be a shareholder of like a stock, right, a publicly traded stock. But obviously, at the end of the day, to be able to trade that stock, there's some limitations, right, because it's not a public entity. So you're going to be an equity holder of this larger entity. And that is what private equity uses to continue to align with doctors, for them to have something at stake to continue to help for the betterment of the organization as a whole. So
Okay.
typically deals are structured anywhere between like 70 to 80% cash and 20 to 30% equity. And that equity is the piece that kind of keeps them intact to continue to act in the best interest of the organization, which is kind of what I mentioned to in terms of alignment. And one or two previous questions that you've had around how do that track record and aligning with the future generation. It's
Mm-hmm.
how do you transition so that the future generation does have something at stake in this larger organization to be able to benefit from outside of their employment contract, knowing that they set out through this journey to join that practice to also be entrepreneurs, right? To also help the practice grow. And that's kind of where that alignment is so important, is really sitting at that equity side to ultimately feel, to ultimately be able to participate in the benefits of the growth of the organization.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's important. So, what right now, like, what are some of the big trends that you're seeing in dermatology and aesthetic mergers and acquisitions right now?
So I think we're seeing three things. Number one, we're seeing that there's been a lot of mergers between larger private equity groups, private equity backed dermatology groups coming together.
Mm-hmm.
So we've seen a lot of that actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
There was, and a good example was like Qualderm came together with Pinnacle,
Yeah.
right? Platinum came together with West. Um, there was a group called River Chase that came together with Water's Edge. So we've seen that over the last, I don't know, 24 to 36 months, if not beyond that, where groups were starting to kind of come together and merging together. The second kind of piece that we're starting to see, and it's just starting to percolate, is there's a number of dermatology private equity backed groups that are starting to explore their so-called second bite or third bite, where the private equity group is kind of towards the end of their investment horizon, and now they're looking for a larger capital partner to take what they built and perhaps go from a regional strategy to a national strategy, or something around continue to bolster the footprint in certain markets, et cetera. So we're starting to see that these groups are starting to, the private equity groups that are backing dermatology platforms are kind of coming towards the end of their investment horizon, which is usually, kind of close to 5 to 7 years, a little bit longer now because of COVID, and are starting to kind of think about, hey, what's my next step, right? Should I look at another, kind of looking at another capital partner for them to continue to grow? And then the third, which has been more recent phenomenon, is there's been a big backing around the medical aesthetic field. A lot of new investors over the last 24 to 36 months, if not even more recent, have been really focusing in on going after an aesthetic strategy, right? And, a med spa strategy or a cosmetic dermatology strategy, where the market in general, whether it's the historical medically driven dermatology groups, right, or the medical aesthetics groups or the cosmetic groups, they're now kind of coming together and saying, wow, there's a huge growth opportunity in the aesthetic field. There is some good assets that are still out there. Let's try to find the right partners, right? Historically, cosmetics and medical aesthetics in the dermatology field, when you were an investor, like in the 2015, 2016, 2017, that wasn't a core focus for them. Their core focus was continuing and focusing on medical, gender, Mohs surgery, etc., maybe dermatopathology. But more recently, now they're saying, well, we've kind of grown our footprint from a medical side. Let's start focus more attention on the cosmetic side. Mm-hmm. So from that lens, I think if you have a practice that is either a med spa or a cosmetic dermatology group, etc., you're going to have a lot of options, right? Because there is going to be this competitive environment from these different types of parties that are interested to partner with you. And then at the same time, you also have, the traditional kind of medical dermatology groups that are continuing to experience some significant opportunities in the market, knowing that the biggest lever for these private equity backed dermatology groups to continue to grow is through additional acquisitions and partnerships. And that continues to drive, that competitive environment continues to drive a lot of activity and also provides a lot of options for the doctors to determine which one may be the right fit for their organization.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So what are some of the biggest mistakes that practice owners make when they are considering a private equity deal?
I think number one is not doing their homework. And what I mean by not doing their homework is truly understanding what are all their options in terms of who would be interested in partnering with them. Mm-hmm. Where there might be some, let's call it one group may come in and say, hey, we'll offer you this really, too good to be true deal. And the doctor comes back and said, well, this is good enough. Let's just go for it. Right. Versus actually taking the time to say, hey, is this, yes, the economics are nice, but is this what's the right fit for our organization? Right. So I think the biggest number one mistake is they're not, doctors aren't looking at all their options to get educated to determine which one of these options are going to be best fit for their respective organization. Because what works for you may not work for me, may not work for my neighbor, may not work for my competitor. So understanding where that fit lies. Number two, I would look where we see mistakes is doctors continue perhaps focusing more on the economics of the transaction rather than the go forward relationship, and truly understanding and being educated around what they're ultimately signing themselves up for, right? And that's very important because, again, this isn't like a widget company where you sell it and then you can go off into the sunset. This is what the rest of your career is going to look like in the medical field for the most part. So not just thinking about it from an economic, but as I continue to allude to, the cultural side, the control side, the resource side, the track record side. So making sure they're taking a comprehensive approach in really determining which group is going to be the right fit and not just think about the money of the deal, I think is crucial. I think the last piece where we see is perhaps, physicians not truly being fully educated and understanding what's in front of them in terms of the transaction and making sure that they're negotiating the points that are actually important to them and knowing that they can negotiate those points. Because look, everything's negotiable, right? Yeah. When you get a standard employment contract, don't think that, hey, I just have to sign this and move on. Mm-hmm. There is a process to go by to make sure that you are protected in a way that you're comfortable with.
Right.
Right.
That makes sense because, you have so many offices and you've got a lot of that you've put into it. When you're starting a business, you're putting a lot into it. So why not, want to make sure that you're keeping, the patient focus, especially if that's something that is important to you. Most physicians probably, they go into this knowing that they want to take care of patients and that they want to provide excellent patient service and things like that. And I feel like, a lot of times if you're going into a an acquisition like this, you want to ensure that that is still going to be there, that you're still going to see that.
Right. No, I can't agree with you more. I think the biggest thing you need to think about when you're exploring a process is the thought that ultimately leads to what is my practice really going to look like after the fact,
Right.
right? And being confident that it's going to look very similar, if not the same, as if it was done before the deal.
Right. Yeah. No, that's really good. You said this before, is know what you're getting into before you sign anything. There's so many companies that are out that will say, oh yeah, we can do this, we can do this, and then I mean, that's just anything online. Like you sign up for a
Right.
product and they're like, oh, this is going to promise you everything, we can do all of these things. And I'm seeing that a lot in like the prior authorization space, just with access for patients. And oh yeah, we can do all these for you, we can make everything so much easier and streamline your process. And then
Right.
you get started and you're like, wait, what happened? Why is this not working the way you said it was? And otherwise I wouldn't have went with you as if I'd known that. That's important. You're risking a lot.
Right. Yeah, no, look, and I think the biggest thing I can note is there's so many variables in a transaction outside of just the money that needs to be discussed and negotiated.
Mm-hmm.
That's ultimately part of the transaction. And just making sure that again, I can't stress enough, you got to know what you're signing yourself up for,
Mm-hmm.
right? You got to really get yourself educated because this is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest decision you're going to make in your terms of your career.
Yeah. So, how do you see the space evolving over the next few years?
It's a good question. I think what I mentioned before, and I truly believe that the consolidation is going to continue. And I think the biggest thing that folks are going to need to understand is, you can't just survive just keeping status quo, right, in this market, right? And, from that lens, when we think about the independent practice of medicine is you got to always continue to think about growth and you got to think about it from a lens of how do you manage growth, but without impeding on the practice of medicine. Right. So I think from that lens, at least from the private equity side, we're seeing a lot of mergers going to continue to happen. We think that there's a lot of folks that are kind of going to start getting their second bite or third bite, as the term kind of alludes to, where the capital partner goes upstream to find a larger capital partner. I think the medical aesthetic field, you're going to see continue consolidation there, right? Kind of let's call it the med spa world or the cosmetic dermatology world.
Mm-hmm.
But I think at the same time, what's very interesting now and what's going to be very interesting over the next couple of years is you're also going to be able to see which groups are actually successful, which ones are not. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to be very important, where people are going to be more equipped to making educated decisions. And they have been, right? But even more so over the next couple of years, because that's going to be a longer track record, right? We're now past COVID. Now it's hopefully business as usual.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's see which groups are actually the ones that are doing well,
Right.
right? So when you're kind of thinking about this, I think the thought process, if I'm that independent practice looking to continue scale and maybe evaluating private equity, you're now going to be able to see the track record and their historical trends, their ability to scale, and understanding if that is something that is viable in terms of, hey, look, am I betting on the right partner that's going to continue to help me grow as well?
Right. So, what does that mean for new physicians coming in? Dermatology is my field. I plan on opening a practice. And what happens when there's so much of these private equity groups? They're all over the place. Does that really leave room for these new physicians? And how can they manage that?
I think at the end of the day, I don't really look at private equity preventing folks from opening up a location because there's private equity surrounding them.
Mm-hmm.
I think the preventative measures is really the cost of capital to open up a new location now, right? To start up your own business. It's not the same as it was historically, right? Even getting pre-approved by an SBA loan or some other type of vehicle to help you get started. At the same time, I think the thought around making sure you're able to negotiate with the payers to be able to get a fair reimbursement is also going to be a tough pill to swallow because it's not any easier to negotiate today,
Mm-hmm.
and it will be harder tomorrow, right? And at the same time as looking at it from a hospital standpoint as well, is what are the hospital relationships that are surrounding that market? Because I think the biggest competitors isn't the private equity groups. I mean, these private equity groups, there's so much white space that there's enough room for everyone in terms of the macroeconomics associated with skincare
Mhm.
and general derm and medical aesthetics, et cetera. I mean, there's enough for everyone to eat. But I think what's the preventive measure for a doctor to open up their new to open up a location if they're entrepreneurial is really driven by cost of capital, their ability to negotiate, their ability to choose the right vendors, their
Mhm.
ability to make sure that you don't have a scenario where the hospital is there and just trying to put pressure on all the independent practices and prevent the insurance payers from being able to allow them to kind of get a fair reimbursement, et cetera. So I think that's the bigger risk rather than private equity groups that are existing or starting up in the dermatology or medical aesthetic field.
Would that ever be something that you would do is help? Maybe there's somebody that's reached out. They're like, I want to start a practice, but I don't have the capital to do it. Would you help build that out for a new dermatologist?
So I haven't thought about that. I think that could be a great area of to help physicians. But
Mhm.
we also don't see many physicians coming out of residency nowadays and saying, "Hey, we want to just start up our own shingle."
Mhm.
I think that there is this notion, and again, not a bad thing, but folks are coming into the medical field saying, "Hey, look, I want to see patients. I
Mhm.
want to go home at 5, 6, 7 p.m.
Don't want
and I
to.
don't want to be opening that laptop up, right?"
That
uh,
makes sense. That's my entrepreneurial side. I'm like,
right,
let me
right.
open up a business. I got an LLC over here.
Yeah, no, but look, personally, I would say that I can't sit there and say I would be the right person for the job, right?
Mm,
We know a lot of the vendors, et cetera, but it would be wrong for me to advise someone to say, hey, this is who you need to use, this is the location you open, et cetera,
mm.
without having any risk associated with it. And then they're left holding the bag, and I feel responsible for the fact that I just drove their practice to the ground because I helped them make some of these decisions. So I want to kind of stay away from that a little bit.
No, that makes sense. So, what is next? Are you ever going to think of going into other specialties? What's next for your company moving forward?
No, that's a great question. So we represent groups across all subspecialties, right? Dermatology, eye care, urology, ortho, pain management. I mean, you name a specialty at this point. I think we have some active representation. We have represented them in the past. I think the biggest focus and the core of what we are looking at as an organization is look, we're always going to continue to scale, continue to grow, and continue to add personnel. Now, we currently have locations in Boston and Chicago. But at the end of the day, what we don't want to do is discount the quality of service that we're seeking to provide our clients, like that white glove approach and the senior level attention from start to finish, the hand holding. So that's what's core to us is look, continue to scale, continue to be that representative for an advocate for the physician groups that are out there, but don't put scale in front of the quality of service. And then I think at the same time, it's very much continuing to stay to our core and only represent the founder-led groups, right? For private equity, don't ultimately work on the buy side where you help the private equity groups find locations or even represent private equity groups on their next sale. We want to move away from, let's call it this conflict of interest that could arise when
Mm,
we're representing the independent groups that are out there.
yeah, that's good. I like how you said that, thinking about not the money side, but when you're trying to grow. But what is one piece that you think that is the most important of advice to give to an independent dermatologist that's thinking about growth?
That's thinking about growth. Is that from a perspective of like valuing private equity or kind of growth on their own?
Yeah, just in general, whether it's private equity, those options are all on the table. Like
Right.
what is something that you would advise?
That's a good question. I think from my point of view is at the end of the day, whoever that physician owner is, make that decision based on what you're seeing in your own practice, not based on what your neighbor is doing, your competitor is doing, etc.
Hmm.
And I think that's so important in this day and age where, you have some advisors say, well, maybe you're not ready for private equity, but if you hire these 3 new doctors, you open up this location and you do that, X, Y, and Z, you're going to get there. But at the end of the day, your practice is best, right? So if you don't have the demand to do that,
Hmm.
don't do that because of a transaction,
Hmm.
right? So I think that the biggest thing I can note to any sort of independent doc looking to grow is look at your own practice from your own DNA, from your own ability and willingness to take more risk rather than understanding what everyone surrounding you is doing, but knowing the fact that, hey, look, if I want to continue to make the same dollar that I made yesterday, I'm going to need to continue to figure out how to continue to grow.
Right. That's good. Well, thank you, Michael. It's been so cool talking to you. And there's so much that I've learned that I did not know. But yeah, it makes so much sense and it can be so helpful for so many providers that are interested in going the private equity route. So,
Yeah, no, look, I appreciate you having me on the show. I think that the biggest thing that I would just note is private equity is not meant for everybody, and that's okay, right? And that's completely fine. But my biggest thought is, people should be open to it, to just understand what it entails, to
right.
determine if it makes sense for your practice or not.
Yeah. Not being afraid of it.
Yeah, don't be afraid. Just because look, if you go through this process and explore your options, right, and who's out there, at the end of the day, all you have to do is say no, and now you've been educated enough to say, look, private equity doesn't make sense for my practice. But no, I appreciate you having me on the show. I think at the end of the day, this field is continuing to evolve, and there's a lot of noise in this field, and we're just trying to kind of focus on the facts and not just the rumors that are out there, to try to ensure people are making educated decisions.
Yeah, that's good. Well, if any listeners have questions for you, how can they get a hold of you or anyone at Physician Growth Partners?
So they can get a hold of me. My email is mkroin, as in Nancy, at physiciangrowthpartners.com. Or they could go on our website, physiciangrowthpartners.com, and they'll be able to kind of fill out a form, et cetera, to get in contact with us. But you also have my contact, so feel free to share it in some sort of post or something along those lines as well.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you so much. It's nice to meet you, Michael.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us this week. Sanofi and Regeneron invite you to learn more about Dupixent Dupilumab at www.dupixenthcp.com. No wonder it's possible. Thanks for spending a few minutes with me and listening to That's Derm Good. You can expect new episodes of That's Derm Good every week. The podcast is available on your favorite app, including where you're listening right now. Subscribe to the podcast so you never miss a new episode. Bye.